All right. Well, good evening and welcome to our annual Reimagining Faith and Public Life. My name is Jay Bruce and I'm the director of the Center for Faith and Flourishing. If you like what you hear tonight, then please go to faithandflourishing.org and click the donate button on the upper right-hand corner and, open up your heart and give us $100, $250, $500,000. If you don't like what you hear tonight, then I'm pleased to report that Ed Erickson, our Chief Academic Officer, is here, and he will field your complaints because in addition to funding from the Center for Faith and Flourishing, the Office of Academic Affairs has generously supported this event as well as the honors program. And you are in for a treat. We have two distinguished guests, Bonnie Kristian, whose book, Untrustworthy, is excellent. I highly recommend it. Bonnie is a columnist at Christianity Today. And then we also have Jeff Bilbro, who's the author of Reading the Times, and he's an English professor at Grove City College. I hope, as a philosopher, that we'll hear about how we need to have intellectual virtues in order to flourish in the muddled culture in which we live. And I'm pleased to report that the Center for Faith and Flourishing has received, JBU, has received a large grant from the Templeton Foundation, the Intellectual Virtues Program, and you can learn more about that at jbuvirtue.org. And many thanks to Matt Wilson and Tricia Posey for the diligent work in getting us that grant. Also, in the back, you'll see that we have the American Values Coalition. They are joining us this evening, and you can go back there and get a free handbook that can help you navigate these issues. And I always like to, have a little goodie here. And so hopefully you received a raffle ticket as you came in, because we are raffling off signed copies of the author's books as well as an American Values Coalition t-shirt. So we have merch as well as intellectual content. The person who is going really to be leading this event is JBU's own Dan Bennett. And hearty credit to Dan, not simply for reimagining faith and public life. This is his baby, but also credit to him for taking time off of his well-earned sabbatical in order to be with us tonight. And I look forward to seeing Dan's book, Uneasy Citizenship, coming out hopefully next year. So with that, I'll step down and I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you also for those joining us on YouTube and streaming. This is the reality in which we live, and it brings many interesting opportunities to have conversations that would otherwise be restricted by geography or place. So it's a very nice change to our circumstances. I wanted to mention, for those of you in the audience, as well as for those streaming online, later in the evening, after the speakers have a chance to provide some initial remarks, and after we have a moderated conversation, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the speakers and engage with them. We've been doing this in the past through the website and the app Slido, S-L-I-D-O. So if you go to slido.com and you type in our event code, which is 1091961, I'll say that a few more times this evening, I think, to make sure people have it. 1091961 on Slido. You can ask questions of each speaker and get their perspectives on this later in the evening. So without further ado, we're going to have each of the speakers come up and provide some initial remarks on the theme of tonight's Reimagining Faith and Public Life, which is Discerning Truth in an Untruthful World. This theme was chosen after the speakers were invited and accepted to come to campus. I think it's very appropriate given their different but also very relevant and related books they've written in the past year. We're going to begin tonight with Bonnie Kristian, the author of Untrustworthy. Bonnie.
All right, thank you. Is this doing? Yeah, oh, great. Okay. Well, good evening, and thank you, everyone, for having me. I know we'll probably go beyond what Jeff and I talk about in this little introduction when we get into lots of different topics in the Q&A portion of the evening. But I wanted to start with the risks of talking and listening to other people talk in public, which is something that with mass media, and particularly social media, most of us do all of the time. And I want to start by sharing a quote from Dorothy Sayers, with whom most of you are probably familiar. Sayers was a theologian and writer in England in the first half of the 20th century. And her work was pretty broad. At one extreme, she did a new translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, and she wrote works of theology about the Trinity and roles of women and the ancient creeds, just sort of like the light and easy stuff. And then at the other extreme, she was also a really excellent detective novelist in the golden age of detective fiction. Think sort of like Agatha Christie, but a little bit more sophisticated. And then in between, I guess you could say, she wrote a series of radio plays for the BBC about the life of Jesus. And it was called The Man Born to be King. It started airing in 1942. And it was very controversial at the time. And the reason it was controversial, and I don't think this would be a big deal now, but back then, she used normal contemporary language for her characters to speak, even using, in some cases, American slang. And there was an expectation that you'd use sort of more formal King James style phrasing to show the proper reverence for the subject matter. And in fact, some people were so angry about it that when Japan captured and occupied Singapore in 1942, around the same time as the play came out, defeating Allied forces there, some people claimed that the defeat was God's very weirdly roundabout punishment for Dorothy Sayers' radio play, that was how he chose to express his dissatisfaction. But so Sayers wrote the play the way she did because she understood, I think, the power of language in public. And she understood that using ordinary language and even slang to retell this story, which was, a very novel tactic back then, she understood that this choice would surprise and upset her audience, and that it had the power to shake them out of sort of bland expectations and perhaps to hear the story as a real historical event for the first time. She said people will be shocked, and rightly. We are prepared for our Lord to be born into the language of the KJV and into stained glass or paint, but we are not prepared for him to be incarnate. And I mention all that to say how seriously Sayers took the power of language in her own work. She wrote for very different audiences and in very different ways, and she knew how language could be used to communicate not just bare facts, but to change who we are, to induce us to love and generosity and curiosity, or to apathy or hypocrisy or hate. And she also knew that not everyone understands public language in the same way, and she found that ignorance very worrisome and very dangerous. And so the same year that her radio play debuted in 1942, Sayers also wrote about the risks of public language itself. Now, this is in the middle of World War II, and so, of course, she noted that she was writing while the common sense of Europe had been undermined and battered down by Nazi propaganda. And now in England, people would have understood that the manipulative and deceptive power of Nazi propaganda. But Sayers wanted to warn that it wasn't just those really glaring and obvious cases where there was a risk. And so she made an analogy between language and scientific experiments. And this is what she wrote. It is as dangerous for people unaccustomed to handling words and unacquainted with their technique to tinker about with these heavily charged nuclei of emotional power as it would be for me to burst into a laboratory and play about with a powerful electromagnet or other machine highly charged with electrical force. At the present time, we have a population that is literate in the sense that everyone is able to read and write, but owing to the emphasis placed on scientific and technical training at the expense of the humanities, very few of our people have been taught to understand and handle language as an instrument of power. This means that in England alone, 40 million innocents or thereabouts are wandering inquisitively around the laboratory, enthusiastically pulling handles and pushing buttons, thereby releasing uncontrollable currents of electric speech, with results that astonish themselves and the world. Now, this kind of innocent ignorance is dangerous enough to our life together, Sayers warned. But of course, not everyone is so innocent, right? She points to the demagogues who can sway crowds, the journalist who can push up the sales of his paper to the 2 million mark, the playwright who can plunge an audience into an orgy of facile emotion, the parliamentary candidate who is carried to the top of the poll on a flood of meaningless rhetoric, the ranting preacher, and the advertising salesman of material or spiritual commodities. And we could expand that list from Sayers quite a bit today, I think. We could add the cable news pundit who browbeats his guest and calls it debate. We could add the Instagram influencer who serves very pretty half-truths to millions of followers, the podcaster whose voice is inside your head every night while you wash the dishes and every morning while you exercise, the public pseudo-intellectual on Twitter who passes off glib little quips as truth. And unlike the innocents in Sayers' laboratory, these people know exactly how powerful language is, and they use it for power, fame, agenda, and profit against, in Sayers' phrase, people who were not armed to resist it and had never really understood that it was a weapon at all. But here's where our situation, I think, is even worse. So in Sayers' time, in the 1940s, the verbally unscrupulous, however powerful, were relatively few in number and comparatively limited in the technology they could use to spread their messages. Here in the United States, it wasn't until the mid-50s that even half of American homes had a TV. And it would be decades more after that before you got 24-hour TV programming, let alone the constant flow of information and truth claims that the internet provides and that we all carry around in our pockets all the time. But it's not just the flow of information coming to us at such an increased pace. What social media does is it invites all of us, the entire public, to play pundit or influencer or politician. We all get to be the speaker, not just the audience. And that means where Sayers could make that little list and point to it and say, here are some categories of people you should watch out for because they understand the power of language in a way you probably don't. Now, at any moment, anyone in our acquaintance can play the demagogue or the playwright or the pseudo-intellectual in our news feeds. We can all wield language as a weapon against each other. We can all talk in public with too little understanding and too much speed. There's no respite and there's no silence. It can come at you at any moment. Everyone has a platform to start talking about the world without, as Sayers put it, first developing a wary determination to understand the potentialities of language and to use it with resolution and skill. And so what I would argue is that responsible and humane use of language in public. As a listener, yes, but especially as a speaker, and we're now pretty much all both, that's not a skill you're born knowing. It is also not something we are all taught. Being able to read and write and post on Facebook makes us literate, but it doesn't mean we understand how to use language in public well. But the good news is that it's a skill anyone can learn, yet it is a skill, and it does require, I think, deliberate cultivation. In the span of a few decades, we massively increased the quantity of language that the average person encounters every day. And much of it makes or assumes major truth claims of what the world is like and what people should do and be. And we didn't equip ourselves for those multiplying encounters. I think we just sort of thought we could handle it or that it wouldn't be a big deal. But at this point, it seems to me the evidence is in and we cannot handle it. Not unprepared at the very least. And not just jumping in and exchanging all of our opinions all the time and pushing buttons and pulling handles and being surprised at the result. And now for those of you who are in college right now, here at JBU, you're in an excellent position to deliberately cultivate the skill of public language. Whatever your major is, you would not go wrong in taking some extra classes, and I don't know what's available, but I'm assuming some extra classes in persuasive writing or journalism or rhetoric and debate. If the philosophy department has a class on logic, I can't recommend that enough. Or if you can learn, about the history of propaganda or conspiracy theories, do something like that. In literally any field, as well as in private life, and having been on hiring committees in the job market, it will not be a bad thing for you to understand how language is used to motivate and to manipulate people. But whether you're in college or not, classes like these are not the only way, or I think by themselves enough, to cultivate the kind of skill that I'm talking about. Because it's not just about gaining knowledge, being aware of logical fallacies or learning to see, where an argument is manipulative. It's much more about cultivating intellectual virtues. And that is what we know is important, and I do recommend all those classes or maybe reading some books on related subjects if you're not in a position to take a class. But even more important is what sort of people we are as we encounter and use language in public. And unfortunately, you can't just decide to be virtuous the way you can decide to take a class. If you could, I would do it, and I would have all the virtues all of the time, but that doesn't work. And so the question is, what intellectual virtues do we need, and how do we cultivate them? And the 3 virtues that I talk about in my book are studiousness, intellectual honesty, and wisdom. Studiousness is about seeking truth well. It's about steering between excesses of vicious curiosity on the one hand and gullibility or obtuseness on the other. A studious person values learning the truth, but she's also attentive to how she learns it, what she does with it, and whether there are other better things on which she should be focusing instead. Studiousness is also a matter of attitude and self-discipline. A studious person must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful, as 2 Timothy 2:24 says. They should be intellectually generous, diligent, and aware of their own limitations. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, says Proverbs 17:27, which is something I find myself Proverbs reading a lot, thinking about social media. It's very embarrassing sometimes to see its advice. But being studious sometimes means shutting up, means not posting. So intellectual honesty comes next, and that's about how we respond to knowledge while we're acquiring it, and how we choose to share our views and information. It requires us to deal in sincerity and good faith, even when we can't expect the same from others. The intellectually honest person scrutinizes his own thinking and is scrupulous about admitting when he's wrong, working to put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, as Ephesians 4:25 says. He asks whether he believes something merely because he wants it to be true, and he'll never dissemble, which means calling evil good and good evil, even though that may be the easier popular course of action. And finally, wisdom is the virtue we need to put the knowledge we've sought and gained to good use. This requires circumspection and prudence, a sort of healthy skepticism that doesn't devolve into cynicism. And I think particularly in our time, it means a very careful curation of your own attention. Wisdom requires rejecting belligerence, pride, and rumor mongering, all of which are encouraged in much of our traditional and social media. Now, as I said, you can't just decide to be studious, intellectually honest, and wise, and bam, it happens. What you can do, though, is scrutinize and change your habits so that these virtues have the opportunity to develop. An analogy I like to use is a big Gothic cathedral, which has the great windows. And think of the windows as the virtues. They're very beautiful, they let in light, but they can't stand by themselves. You need the big stone walls to hold them up. And habits are like these walls, especially habits about your time use, where you place your attention and what voices, which probably means podcasters and pundits and influencers right alongside family, friends, and pastors, what voices you're giving authority over your thoughts, and crucially, your instincts. Remember, Sayers talked about words as heavily charged nuclei of emotional power. The risk here isn't just to our conscious and rational thought that we might accidentally believe some misinformation or whatever. Virtue and habits are the remedy much more than intake of new and better information, because there will always be bad information out there. There will always be verbally unscrupulous people. There will always be lies and manipulation. The real issue is not the lies or the knowledge, but us as knowers. It's not just whether you understand that language can be used as a weapon, as Sayers worried. It's whether you have become the sort of person who can be trusted to handle it well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. We're going to turn now to Jeff Bilbro, who is the author of Reading the Times.
Great. Thanks, Dan and Kaylin, for making this happen. I think the last time I was hanging out with Dan, we were undergraduate tutors together, so it's kind of fun to pick up the conversation a few years later, just a few. I want to begin with 2 confessions. The first is that I'm not going to give you any kind of simple technique to discern truth amid our media ecosystem. Sorry. There's not an app for that, right? There's no solution. And in fact, I think oftentimes large systemic problems don't have these kinds of large systemic solutions that we often want. And the people who sell us solutionism are often con men looking to profit from this problem that ails us. So the work of discerning truth is hard and ongoing. It takes the kind of intellectual virtues that Bonnie was talking about. My second confession is a declaration of belief, right? Confession in the other sense, which is simply this: metaphors matter. I'm an English prof, so I gotta say that. In the context of communication technologies, evocative metaphors may in fact be the most potent way to raise our awareness regarding the hidden affordances and subtle nudges of the technologies that we use. Neil Postman gestures to this. He has an interesting revision of Marshall McLuhan's famous adage, "The medium is the message." Postman says, actually, the forms of our media are rather like metaphors, working by unobtrusive but powerful implication to enforce their special definitions of reality. Whether we are experiencing the world through the lens of speech or the printed word or the television camera, our media metaphors classify the world for us, sequence it, frame it, enlarge it, reduce it, color it, argue a case for what the world is like. So the media through which we conduct our conversations powerfully shape the kind of conversations that are possible. In other words, the textual technologies that we use supply the metaphors that we live by. And I'm riffing here on a book by that title, where the authors Lakoff and Johnson argue that the best way to think beyond a particular metaphor, right, if we're caught within the confines of metaphor, the best way to think beyond that is to propose a new metaphor. So when imaginative authors, when literary authors try to think outside the dominant metaphors that are imposed by their communication technologies, they tend to do so through other metaphors. Metaphors, like technologies, carry entailments. They too orient us toward the world in ways that imply certain possible actions and obscure others. And that's why reflecting on media metaphors might enable us to imagine more healthy ways of understanding and using the dominant media technologies of our day. So I'm going to sketch 3 possible metaphors that I'm going to take from the 19th. If Bonnie goes back to Dorothy Sayers, I'm going to go back a generation or 2 earlier to Herman Melville. And look at 3 metaphors he proposes to orient readers to communication technologies that were reshaping his world. In particular, things like the telegraph, industrial printing, the railroad, etc. If you think about it, Ben Franklin is using a printing press, Revolutionary era, that's virtually technologically indistinguishable from Gutenberg's press. Nothing has really changed, fundamentally. And then in the next several decades, 50, 60 years, all kinds of technological transformations happen. And I would argue, I'm not going to have time to support this, but I'll just leave this on the table, that in many ways those technological transformations were more disruptive than the digital ones that we've experienced today. But regardless, I think we can gain some good wisdom for today from authors who lived through that time. Melville is going to articulate 2 contrasting metaphors that offer kind of competing opposite views. Some saw steam-powered printing and others, these other technologies, as an iron Paul, a kind of mechanical apostle that will infallibly promote the gospel of truth and righteousness. Others saw it as a Noah's wine press or a Colt's revolver, a spreader of anarchy and confusion and pain. Okay? These are this kind of optimism and pessimism. But Melville also offers an alternative metaphor by which we might understand ourselves as readers and truth seekers. And if we imagine ourselves as pilgrims tattooed with the sign of the cross, perhaps we can traverse our chaotic media landscape alongside friends and journey together toward truth. So in other words, the fundamental question isn't which media technology will spread truth or untruth, but which posture we're called to take in order to faithfully pursue truth. So that's where I'm going. Before I get there, quick discursus. I need to identify a set of bearings by which we can make sense of our digital media landscape and Melville's set of metaphors in turn. And it won't surprise you that these bearings come in terms of another metaphor. The Catholic social thinker Ivan Illich describes the experience of living through radical technological shift in terms of crossing a watershed, crossing through a whole watershed. He claims that when industrial technologies replace traditional tools, there are significant improvements. Things get better really quick. And then at some later inflection point, right, you go through the whole watershed, at some later point, the industrial tools begin causing new problems that didn't exist before, and the marginal utility of further professionalization and industrialization begins to decline. And it's after the second watershed is passed that the application of these technologies often does more harm than good. So in the context of medicine, Illich locates the first watershed somewhere around 1913. You get germ theory, new medicines, health radically improves. And yet today, we're spending more on health than we ever had before, and life expectancy is beginning to decline, right? And there's these chronic diseases, iatrogenic diseases, those induced by medical treatments. The cost of healing is dwarfed by the cost of extending sick life. So, you can place that second watershed somewhere, but there's certainly more and more people are realizing there's limits to the further application of such technologies. And Illich traces a similar trajectory in many spheres: education, transportation, etc. In each of these, the second watershed, right, when the introduction of more industrialization causes harm, is characterized by a violation of human or biological limits. So mature industrial technologies are experienced as oppressive to the extent that they treat persons as machines rather than as persons. And as Illich's metaphor suggests, we often don't recognize these either of them, but especially the second one, when we cross them. If you're driving through Indiana somewhere, it's flat, cornfield, nothing's happening, and yet imperceptibly you've crossed the line, and the water now is going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence rather than the Gulf of Mexico, right? So drastic implications from an unnoticeable line you've crossed. And in part, I think what makes us unnoticeable is that we have this massive optimism generated by technologies, and that can blind us to their negative side effects when they begin generating these. If we cross, and this is maybe debatable, but if we cross the first watershed of digital technologies at some point in the early 1990s, perhaps the 2007 release of the iPhone marks at least some kind of new watershed where the amplification of these technologies introduces new problems. Maybe a recent example can clarify this distortion. In March 2011, if you remember back that far, there was this thing happening called the Arab Spring, right? And the Egyptian president is resigned, and this Google engineer who was at the center of a lot of these protests in Egypt gives a TED Talk extolling the power of what he calls Revolution 2.0. And then just 4 years later, 2015, he gives a second TED Talk that begins this way. I once said if you want to liberate a society, all you need is the internet. I was wrong. And the second TED Talk is a kind of retraction of his first one. And he basically articulates how social media effectively coordinates dramatic protests, right? It was incredibly powerful, but it failed to facilitate the deliberation needed to turn these kind of performances into democratic governance, right? So as he puts it, the post-revolution events were like a punch in the gut. The euphoria faded, we failed to build a consensus, the political struggle led to intense polarization. Social media only amplified that state by facilitating the spread of misinformation, rumors, echo chambers, and hate speech. The environment was purely toxic. So in 2011, Facebook and Twitter are going to spread truth and democracy around the world. 2015, of course, 2017, commentators are always describing social media as eroding the information on the underpinnings of democracy, and they're going to destroy the world, right? So the second watershed is somewhere in our rearview mirror, but many pundits, analysts hadn't realized this because the very technologies that they once lauded as salvific had shifted in their effects. So I think Melville's contrasting metaphors for communications technologies of his day originate from these kind of two watershed points. The first, the printing press as an iron pawl, a mechanical proclaimer of the gospel, names the experiences of those who are benefiting from this introduction of new technologies. And the confidence men, one of the titular con men, Frank, proclaims the wonders of modern print in this fashion. The press speaks for truth, though impaled, in the teeth of lies, though entrenched. Disdaining for it the poor name of cheap diffuser of news, I claim for it the independent apostleship of advancer of knowledge, the iron Paul. Paul, I say, for not only does the press advance knowledge, but righteousness. In a word, what the sovereign of England is titular, I hold the press to be actually defender of the faith. Defender of the faith in the final triumph of truth over error, metaphysics over superstition, theory over falsehood, machinery over nature, the good man over the bad. Whew, sounds awesome, right? Frank's companion, who is in fact another con man, holds a rather different view. Speaking for those who have crossed over the second watershed, and who are now experiencing the chaos and confusion caused by information abundance and the breakdown of traditional institutional authorities. Charlie praises a different press, the wine press of Noah, which solves disagreements in its own fashion. Praise be unto the press, the rosy press of Noah, which giveth rosiness of hearts by making men long to tarry at the rosy wine. Who hath babblings and contentions? Who without cause inflicteth wounds? Praise be unto the press, the kindly press of Noah, which knitteth friends, which fuseth foes. Praise be unto the press, the free press of Noah, which will not lie for tyrants, but make tyrants speak the truth. So Melville's biblical cadences in Charlie's speech are proclaiming wine as a sort of panacea, right, for polarization, tyranny, injustice, ignorance, etc. And the press of wine, I guess, heals clumsily, indiscriminately, chaotically a fragmented world. It may not spread truth, but hey, who needs truth if you can just get drunk and forget all your cares? That's his point, basically, right? So Frank disagrees, and that's when he says, I get that some sour sages regard the press in the same way as a Colt's revolver, because it involves, along with multiplication of the barrel, no consecration of the aim. But he disagrees, and so they get in this debate. And I want to say that these two sets of metaphors, right, the iron paw, the Noah's press, the Colt's revolver, present stark contrast, right? And which is it? Given that The Confidence Man was published on April Fool's Day, maybe we shouldn't expect a straight answer from this text. But in Clarel, which is a long narrative poem that nobody reads, which is actually quite brilliant. It's published 20 years later, near the end of his life. Melville returns to these questions about the effects of media technologies, and he ponders not like some sort of technologically determined speaker of truth, sower of chaos, but instead examines what is our posture as truth seekers. The poem's protagonist, Clarel, feels the Bible has become a dead book, no longer speaks to him. And he's struggling with all kinds of issues about, Darwinianism, scientific materialism, etc. And he goes to the Holy Land to try to get in touch with where Christ came, reconnect with a living Word. His pressing questions about modern science and religious disagreements and political conflicts are not given answers along his journey, but he meets all these fellow pilgrims, and he nonetheless finds sustaining friendships and an unlikely faith by the end of the book. One of his friends is a man with a living fresco tattooed in blue and red on his arm. There's a cross set beneath Jerusalem palms, and then a star with 3 crowns. And he explains that this tattoo symbolizes the journey of the Magi as they follow the star to Bethlehem. It's also then the ensign of these later pilgrims who journey to Jerusalem and kneel at Calvary. At the end of the poem, Melville comes back to this image, and he acknowledges that many despair of ever finding the truth. The ancient Sphinx remains uninterpreted, despite all the discoveries of modern science and technology. Nevertheless, Clarel refuses cynical despair, the bitter skepticism that many lapse into when truth eludes their grasp. Instead, he finds, quote, faith with blood warm oozing from her wounded trust, inscribes even on her shards of broken urns the sign of the cross. As Paul does in 2 Corinthians, Melville imagines us as earthen vessels, jars of clay, right? We're fragile, fallible, but we're written on by Christ's redemptive blood. And if we, like Paul says, always carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus, this is so that the life of Jesus, the one who is himself the truth, might also be revealed in our bodies. Clarel serves as this reminder that truth seekers have always faced serious challenges. Con men always want us to see our current technological situation as unprecedented and determined, because that's how they sell you stuff. Yet our hope today is the same as Clarel's, because the person who declared himself to be truth has discerned and found us. We can journey together toward truth. Okay, let me close, because this talk of metaphors and theology is great, gets me excited, but what does it actually have to do with the task of daily discernment? So I suggested at the very beginning that metaphors carry entailments that orient us to our world. And I want to suggest that these 3 metaphors Melville have very radically different implications. For instance, if we insist that our phones, these digital technologies, are a kind of silicon Paul, right, a kind of apostle of knowledge in this digital age, we will see Twitter, or other, insert technology of your choice, as a means of sharing facts and knowledge, that should lead to agreement and universal harmony, right? Truth. And then we'll be really frustrated and surprised when these outcomes don't appear. And we might yell at people who spread what we see as misinformation, and then we'll cling to the facts and the explainers that keep promising to provide certainty and clarity. But I think we'll have the wrong expectations. If, on the other hand, we insist that social media is like a Colt's revolver and that it amplifies the barrel but doesn't consecrate the aim, we might just give up on truth and turn to TikTok as a means of spreading snark and chaos and amusement, or Netflix as an opiate to dull our boredom as we bob meaninglessly along the current. We'll be cynical and despairing, and we'll see no point in acting faithfully in response to those portions of truth we can discern. But if we imagine ourselves as cross-bearing pilgrims, like Melville does, perhaps we can look for ways to use social media and other digital tools to bear witness to our fellow pilgrims of the truth that we have glimpsed, and then in turn listen to the meaning that their lives bear. As cross-bearers, we should seek to embody sacrificial love rather than seek our own power or prominence or pleasure. And as pilgrims, we'll prioritize friendships with our fellow travelers. Further, we'll recognize that the ultimate goal of information is not some kind of gnosis, not some kind of intellectual knowledge, but metanoia, or repentance, right? That our lives should actually conform to the truth that we discern. Discernment is never an end in itself. It should always result in loving action. Finally, Melville's image of a cross-bearing pilgrim reminds us that flashy new verbal technologies don't change the fundamental purpose of speaking and listening, writing and reading. The point of these activities isn't to spread ideas, but to transform persons. And if we imagine ourselves as pilgrims exchanging testimonies on our way to an encounter with God, perhaps we'll be in a better position to navigate our chaotic media landscape graciously and redemptively. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Bonnie. Did you know that you can submit questions via Slido? You can. If you'd like to engage with the speakers tonight, you can go to slido.com. The event code is 1091961. 1091961 on slido.com to ask questions, and we'll get to those here in a moment. I want to start with a question for both of you. This is the 6th iteration of Reimagining Faith in Public Life that we've done. We've had speakers, I think we've had a total of, 11. You guys are the 13th, or 12th and 13th speakers to come to campus. This is arguably the least connected topic or theme that we've had. As a political scientist, I envision this event as a reflection on engagement in politics. All right, these are the questions that are interesting to me. Democratic values, constitutionalism, liberalism, things like this. But at the same time, this theme of discerning truth in an untruthful world is arguably the most important theme that we've had as we think about this relationship between faith and public life. And so I'm not going to ask you here to be explicit. What are the implications of what you're talking about for Christians' engagement in politics, in culture? Why, and be explicit here, does this matter?
I mean, I think we're obliged to say yes, or else no one will buy our books, right?
Right, yeah.
I mean, I think it's connected to politics because we all have this idea that the way that we do politics now and the way that we're like good citizens is to talk about politics ad nauseum in public, which typically means on social media. And so anytime we're talking about these questions around truth and uncertainty of what is true or trustworthy, it's not exclusively politics, I suppose, but I think 80 to 90% of the time the examples and like the relational situations that people have in their minds when they're hearing about this, it is about politics. And so it does have broader applications, certainly, but in a culture like ours where so much is politicized and politics is for many people sort of a hobby, and a hobby that they feel they have to have, or they're somehow being irresponsible, which I would very much reject. I think the whole point of having a representational system is that you delegate that to people who want to do it on a more full-time basis, and you go do other better things, but we've given up on delegating probably because the delegates do such a bad job, and so we all want to do it ourselves all the time. And so, yeah, I think it's hard to you could, I suppose, have a conversation about the things our books are about and talk about it exclusively in non-political terms, but it'd be tricky.
Yeah, along those lines, I think, is it Etienne Hirsch has this book about
Hobbyism.
Yeah, this idea that, right, that it's an entertainment complex, and he makes a great point in there that the people who read the most and talk the most about politics do the least in their communities, politically even, right? So it's often actually an inverse relationship between the amount of outrage you feel at what your uncle posted on Twitter and the amount of effort you put in to improving the lives of your community, right? Whether that's changing policies or other ways. So I think that's a really important observation, right? That in an age where you seems like there's this obligation to be politically informed, we need to recognize that oftentimes that that kind of activity is really a kind of entertainment or amusement, and it's disconnected from the actual work of politics. And then hopefully that frees us to take up the work of politics in the kind of classical sense of tending the health of the polis, right? Which may look like voting, but my word, it sure looks like a lot more than that. So figure out how to love your neighbor in ways that go far beyond being angry at the opinion they have about some issue that neither of which you have any influence over.
I want to come back to this idea of, having an opinion simply because you're expected to have an opinion. I want to come back to that here in a little while. Slido.com, 1091961.
What are you trying to sell, Dan?
I'm going to say this a few more times just because I don't have a graphic to share. But speaking of selling things, Jeff Bilbro's Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news from InterVarsity Press. Untrustworthy is a long subtitle.
I know, you got to do it though.
The knowledge crisis breaking our brains, polluting our politics, and corrupting Christian community. I do like the alliteration.
It's hard to get through in one breath. I did it to myself. I shouldn't have.
From Brazos Press. Very good books, very relevant to where we are today. You're speaking to an audience of students and mostly, university educators, staff. What role do you think the university, higher education in particular, plays in mitigating what Bonnie calls in her book this epistemic crisis?
You're in the university. I think you should start.
I mean, one of the things is I hope it offers an alternative model and practice of education. So we tend to, if we're trying to be informed by the broader news media ecosystem, we tend to want quick answers, clear answers, maybe clear sides, or we get a few talking heads, then going back and forth. That represents some kind of dialogue. And that's our model of learning about stuff. And I hope that, from what I know of John Brown's is true, and other schools like where I teach, when we're trying to discipline our minds in a classroom, following a syllabus, we're offering a different kind of education, a kind of formation, right? One that's much slower, much less, superficially entertaining, but hopefully way more satisfying. And one that really, ideally, is oriented toward truth and clarity rather than victory. So I think the key problem with our political conversation is people are looking at short term, how can I win this election that in this case is like 2 weeks away or something less. Rather than how can I speak the truth and how can we journey toward truth together. And the university is not a perfect space, but it's one of those last places, us institutional spaces as a culture that's kind of set apart for the good of pursuing the truth. So ideally you learn those habits at a university and then you carry them with you the rest of your life. But the kind of alternative formation offered by the social media is powerful.
I don't know that I have anything to add. That's a lot of the things that I wanted to say. We were talking earlier about the tension in a lot of universities and colleges right now of, am I here sort of as a job training program, and do I need to do these core gen ed courses outside of my major, especially in the humanities. And I remember being frustrated with a lot of those classes when I was in undergrad. I didn't want to take a science class as a political science major. I didn't see how it could ever benefit me. But I think especially when you're looking at, as I said, things about language and logic and rhetoric. One, if your concern is sort of like the job prep stuff, like that stuff really helps. I can't tell you how great it is to receive a job application from someone who can write a coherent sentence. But two, like again, if you do want to be so engaged in sort of like public disputes about and searching for truth, then yeah, the university, like Jeff said, should be a place where you learn to do that in a little bit better and slower manner.
So we're starting to get some questions in on Slido, but I'll give the pitch one more time. Slido.com, code 1091961. We'll get to those questions here in a second. Maybe quick questions, maybe one for each of you. First of all, Bonnie, I referenced this in the book club earlier this afternoon, and it's a fresh passage only because I recently cited it in the book that I'm writing right now. One of the most interesting pieces I found in your book, in one of the later chapters, a piece of practical advice for people. You wrote that we should choose to know only a few stories well. And I'm wondering if you could explain, and you do this in the book, but go ahead and explain why we should only choose to know a few stories well, and what's the danger when we try to not do that?
Yeah, so I think we have this sense that it's very important to be up on the news and to be broadly aware and have just sort of a broad sense of everything that's happening in the world, and especially in your own country, and especially at the national level. And the problem with that is when you're trying to know a little bit about everything, you know it all very shallowly, and that makes you much more susceptible to lies about it. If you just know a little bit and you're sort of following things at the surface level, at the headline level, maybe you don't even click through because who has the time? It's very easy to be fooled by something because you don't have any context for it, and not even necessarily fooled by malicious lies, right? By someone's mistake. That's very easy to have that happen to you, and you'll never be the wiser. You just believe this false thing, and so I think it's far better if you want to be regularly engaged in the news to pick, I don't know, maybe I would say the average person can't do more than a half a dozen sort of big picture stories, and I don't mean like this election, but like a topic on the scale of like, I don't know, the war in Ukraine or immigration policy, something sort of big and durable. It's going to last across presidential administrations, across election years, and put in the time to actually know it well. Like, don't just read news stories about it, maybe read books about it. Become familiar with sort of the important people, the important legislation, the important organizations, like what's actually going on in this sphere. And then when you do come across some, say, random news article from an outlet you're not really familiar with, you'll know enough to be able to discern what in this article, comports with what I already know and is likely true and valuable, and what, maybe did the reporter misunderstand, or what is this person they're quoting lying about. And so it's much better to know a few things well than a lot of things a little, which in practice means a lot of things badly. And I do this, I try to limit my own topics, like even in journalism. There are a lot of really important topics you will almost never see me write on because, sometimes I might make sort of like an oblique point, but things like immigration and the environment and abortion, these are really important topics. And very, very occasionally I might have something sort of related to say about that. But 99% of the time I don't cover these topics because I don't know them well, and I don't have anything to add to that conversation without, risking misinforming myself, misinforming other people, because I can't know everything, and I have other things that I've put my time into, and I think that's a useful practice for the news audience, not just those of us writing.
No, I think it's a good reminder. Jeff, you mentioned in your talk tonight, you also mentioned it, in your book, it's kind of an important part of your book, is that the information revolution that we're currently experiencing now isn't particularly new, right? There's been these advances in technology that we've had to adjust to in the past. I think that's right. I'm wondering, though, if you could speak to, is there something that's especially challenging about this particular revolution? And you said you were going to leave that on the table, saying, the other stuff's actually maybe more crazy. But maybe what is something that's especially challenging about where we are right now?
Sure. And I guess what makes me hesitant to opine on this is because I feel like you don't know it, until a few generations have passed. We all read the sections in Plato about the invention of writing and like what that's going to do to us, right? Or the ways that people try to understand the effects of Gutenberg. those took centuries to unfold. So basically, Dan, you're asking me to make a fool of myself. But I think...
And it's recorded.
Yeah, well, hopefully this recording gets memory hold before. Anyway. But I think one of the differences is that these technologies are particularly... I mean, this is, again, is somewhat true of the 19th century, but even more so, it's democratic, right? So we all have access to speak. And the incentive structures then are, again, is this new? I don't know, because I'm just rehearsing Nathan Hatch's argument, the democratization of American Christianity, about how some of these things changed the church in the early 19th century. But when we all can speak, then what kind of speech gets attended to is not often, sober, slow, careful. It's the shrill, the glib, the entertaining, the inflammatory. And so our discourse gravitates to those things because that's where our attention is. And I think trying to find new kinds of social norms, family norms, church norms that can limit and guide our prioritization of these kinds of speeches is going to be crucial, but not easy.
Yeah. Bonnie, in your book, you reference this idea that the democratization of information has made us all orators. Not all of us are up to this task, including most of, I would imagine, us on this stage. So we're going to get to some Slido questions now. We got some good ones coming in here.
What's that number, Dan?
For Slido.com? Yeah. The Slido.com number to submit questions to our fine speakers, 1091961. We're going to start with a softball here. Under the dominant philosophical postmodern worldview, truth is relative. Is our culture too far gone to even recognize objective truth? Don't all answer at once.
I don't think so. I think most people, outside academia at least, if you push them, they will, come to something that they actually do hold quite firmly. They might not describe it as objective truth, but I think we all function with quite a lot of things that we treat as very certain, even if we don't want to use that phrasing. I do think that because of where our culture is on this, it's important to recognize that just because objective truth exists doesn't mean that you at any given moment have it on any particular subject, and that being willing to acknowledge that and to allow for the possibility that you might be wrong in a particular conversation can go a long way toward helping people who are skeptical of objective truth maybe warm up to the idea a little bit and maybe recognize that some of their skepticism is less about the concept as a whole, because they probably already function to some degree as if they think there are objective truths, but that perhaps their skepticism is more about the way that some people behave as if they have somehow arrived at complete objective knowledge of all the important truths and could not possibly be at fault or incorrect in any way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As an English prof, the big conferences like the MLA, and after Trump's election, the MLA had this come to Jesus moment about what have we done. The conference is pretty funny. So I think that speaks to this sense that truth is relative until it's not. And maybe one thing that Christians can do, and this gets to what Bonnie was saying, is try to be careful in distinguishing between our kind of faith commitment to the existence of objective truth, but also a real kind of epistemic humility about our ability to always discern it. And I think that gets kind of what you're saying, right? So if we can practice the intellectual virtues that help us journey toward truth more faithfully, everyone wins, and we're also not, transgressing against the reality of truth when we maybe blaspheme about it by pretending that we know it about these particular issues, right? I think that's the danger.
Right. So this next question is amusing to me the way it's written. I enjoy getting, quote, off the grid, end quote, from time to time and think I could be a hermit. At what point is disengaging escapist, socially irresponsible, and unchristian?
It's a great question.
Do you want to start?
I get this all the time, yeah, because I like Thoreau and Wendell and these guys. I've been accused of being a Luddite, so
Wasn't
go
Thoreau
for it.
like a mile from town?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a total mystery, and he wasn't pretending to be more than a mile from town. So I think a couple things. One, there is no moral obligation to be informed, and You're not escaping the world if you're not staying up to date on everything. So we need to kind of disentangle that. Like, there are other ways of being engaged. And two, I think what's healthy is, and this is actually very Thoreauvian, right? He doesn't stay at the pond. He goes there for 2 years and has a kind of imaginative shift, and then he takes the fruits of that back with him when he goes to town. So I think finding these kind of rhythms are really crucial. The church calendar is full of liturgical rhythms. The church week is full of these rhythms. You know, a lot of people like Andy Crouch, Bonnie keeps recommending Common Rule.
Yeah, Justin Whitmell early.
Yeah, so a lot of people talk about, you know, maybe we need to have like days off, you know, like Sabbath, maybe off the grid, or chunks of our day that are off the grid. So I think all of us need to have healthy rhythms in our life where we are not always connected. And what those particular proportions are maybe differs depending on who you are and what your callings are, but nobody should be plugged in all the time.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I'm never going to go off the grid. My life, my job depends on being on the grid. But I think, you know, if you have a job, a way of life, you're independently wealthy, I don't know, that permits you to do that, and that's what you want to do, I would say my judgment of whether that's gotten into the sort of like bad space that the question is worried about would be much more about like what other things are you doing, you know, or are you a misanthrope out in your cabin, you know, never talking to anyone and just living with your cat. Like, that's very different than if you have like a thriving community life and it just happens to not be on social media and email.
Deciding which one I want to. There's
So
a couple
we're downvoting some here.
Well, yeah, I'm deciding here. Okay, I like. Oh, this is a good question. So one thing we've had in the past with these events are speakers who share Christian faith or share some broader foundations of these deeply held convictions, but disagree with each other when it comes to politics or policy. And so I'm wondering, could you guys speak to that? You know, to what extent you're very nice people.
To air our disagreements?
Yeah, well, yeah.
We've prepped for that.
Let's do it. Let's talk about the ways in which you might disagree with each other's work or perspectives on these issues.
It's not on these issues. It's about drugs. I think they should be legal, and he doesn't.
Great.
So yeah, not really apt. I don't know. We've talked about this. We don't have.
Yeah, we don't have. I think
we
we worried about that because neither of us are super enthusiastic about some kind of large scale, either governmental or tech company solution to these problems. Right? We're both. And I think, you know, even though maybe politically Biden's a little more libertarian and a little more localist, I don't know.
I like local stuff.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of. I think
it's going great.
Anyway, I was going to say I think even both of us also see the value of individual kind of virtues and actions, but also really want to, and you can maybe disagree. I don't want to speak for you, but also really want to carve out some space for kind of institutions, families, churches, schools, to help each other, because we're not lone rangers, and these technologies are social and cultural. And while I can make choices about what I do with my phone and my habits, I need friends to make choices that help me act well. Virtue is not something you can achieve on your own.
Yeah, those are all not government institutions, so
I know.
I'm very for it. Yeah, no, I mean, I think what Jeff said is right, that neither of us really see a big fix swooping in to save us. And I mean, for me, certainly that is also fed by like my libertarian skepticism of big government programs working on things like that. But yeah, it is very much something that you need institutions for, and that I think especially maybe you'll get sort of your own habits in order, but especially if you want to address these issues on a family scale and with younger children and children getting into like the teen years and having friends, what their friends are doing is going to be a huge effect on what they want to do and what kind of rules they consider tolerable. And so that's where, church life and institutions and school really comes in. And I'm sorry, that wasn't what the question wanted.
Maybe we can do an arm wrestling match afterwards to sate that particular desire. There's a lot of questions in here from a practical perspective, and I think there's a desire to learn, okay, how do we incorporate some of these things into our daily lives? So I'll start with, okay, so there is an election coming up in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today, the midterm elections.
Right now, there's a Senate debate happening in our home state.
That's right.
So-
Both of our speakers hail from Pennsylvania, and so I'm sure you'll get caught up on that later.
Probably not.
Probably, maybe, we'll see. And so voters, when you go to vote, you vote on a variety of ballot measures and candidates. In a presidential election year, you've probably done a decent amount of research on who you're voting for president, and, hopefully governor and senator, maybe representative, but then as you get down to the more local level, the average person starts to get a little fuzzy. And
city treasurer.
I don't know. I have a pretty strong opinion. No, but this is a good question. So how do we balance the good of specialization, like you were talking about, Bonnie, about becoming really well versed in just a few things, with the need to make informed decisions about voting more broadly? So how do we balance that tension, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing to sort of like cram for the election, right? Like, you can sit down and say, I want to vote in this election. I'm going to take an afternoon and study up on these candidates. I also think when we're talking about local races, which it can be very hard to find. Like, I've tried to vote for judges before, and it's so difficult. They do not put good information out about what they're for. Your city could be one of your handful of issues that you study and know well. Like, that could be something that you keep up with regularly if you really want to be able to vote well in local stuff. But yeah, I don't think cramming is a bad thing for this. You can sit down and find out what's going on right before the election, and it doesn't. You don't have to. You're not ready for a test in college all of the time, right? Like, you do it at a certain time, and in the same way, you don't need to have vote-ready levels of knowledge about everything all the time. You can just catch up.
Yeah, I think it's great advice, and I would just, again, as a localist, say, oftentimes in some states, in Arkansas, does your vote for president matter? Not usually. So why waste your time, thinking about that? Dedicate the limited time you do have to these. Maybe sometimes it's the primaries, right? Sometimes those are the much more in Pennsylvania, where in the local elections, it's the primaries that matter where I live. So I spend a lot more time this spring thinking through the different candidates and choosing how I voted there. Whereas at this point, it's not as important.
Yeah. And conversely, in the general, I mean, if you are one of those people who fortunately or very unfortunately, I don't know, one way or another lines up with the political party the vast majority of the time, I don't think party line voting is the worst thing if that works for you. It doesn't work for me. If it works for you, I mean, yeah, that might make sense.
Save some time at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Another practical question. What are some specific things you have found helpful to say when talking with those with whom you disagree? Or maybe things you say, or maybe a mindset you have when going into those conversations?
This came up in our discussion this afternoon, and I would just reiterate what I said there, which is I try really explicitly to frame the disagreement as not essential to who I am, who that person is, to our friendship. Especially if I'm talking to a family member. Maybe I talk about these things less, but when they do come up, I try to clarify, like, we can disagree about this thing. I think Knapp has a shirt back there, right? Disagree with me, friends. We can have this issue that we disagree about, and I think you're wrong, you think I'm wrong. That's okay. I have a lot of friends who think I'm wrong, and they're probably right. So I think walking in with that kind of intellectual humility can diffuse some of the tensions. And it's not wishy-washy, right? You're not saying that what you think doesn't matter, but you're recognizing that our friendship, who you are as a person, is more important than the disagreement.
And I would say that my answer would depend a lot on whether I realistically think we can have a conversation like that. Like, if it's a conversation where I'm sort of like confronting someone and I'm going to tell them, I saw your post on Facebook, it was so wrong, here's all the ways it was wrong, like, that probably just shouldn't happen at all. Something that I say a lot in my book is, like, don't try to argue with people that your loved ones that you think are wrong. You're not going to change their minds. If they didn't invite the conversation, if you're not both coming to the conversation willing to have like this reasoned debate, and you're both, sort of like putting your beliefs on the table and saying maybe my mind will change. No one's mind will change.
That's why it's so different. As I remember, I had some awesome conversations as an undergrad, late at night in the dorm room, because I don't know, our opinions were still being formed. You cannot have that same conversation with your grandmother or your parent even, right?
Yeah, going and confronting your grandma is never going to end well.
Work.
And so I think
why?
Unless you are in a relation, unless the relationship is such and the specific conversation is such that both people want to be there and want to be debating it in the way that Jeff described, I think it is far better to not have that conversation and to talk about other things. I have an easy out. I can just say, I do not want to talk shop. Politics is shop. Let's please discuss something else. I realize not everybody has that, but I think that there was a reason for the norm of not talking about politics with people. And the reason is that most of the time, most of us, and this frequently includes me, cannot handle these real life intense conversations with someone with whom we already have all other complicated emotional histories, and you can get their ire up and score points, and it profits no one anything.
And it's just so weird. I would never walk up to my neighbor and say, what do you think about this particular piece of legislation? and yet that's what people post on social media, right? We post, not pretty legislation, but this court case, this political issue, and so then we all know what everybody thinks. And that level of knowledge, I think as Bonnie's saying, kind of breaks these social norms, and it's not conducive to full-orbed human relationships where politics is one aspect of who we are, but my political opinions don't define who I am.
Yeah. You were a crank relatively recently. You were a crank if you brought up politics all the time. If you tried to share news articles with someone because it would be like a clipping, you were a crank if you did that. And I would suggest that you're still a crank if you do it, and don't do it.
It's just more socially acceptable now on social media.
Yeah, we're all cranks, but that doesn't actually make it better.
I think it's a good tagline for this event. We're all cranks. Someone asked a follow-up question here, and I'm a big fan of intellectual humility only because I'm wrong most of the time. But
your wife's here, so you have to say that, right?
It's great. Yes, exactly right. I am curious, and I think this is a pretty good, quick follow-up question, I think. How do you exercise intellectual humility when you know that you're right? And so the example being that they gave, if someone is saying they see a circle and they're like, oh, that's actually a square. How do you exercise humility in those circumstances?
I guess this person's also thinking about kind of conspiracy theory type, just craziness.
I would imagine so.
Yeah. Maybe back to Bonnie's point where you just have to reground this person on something that if it's with Dan says something crazy, I'm going to ask him about the Portland Trail Blazers, and we're going to talk sports, So kind of redirecting, because that can maybe decenter that issue. I don't think it's a complete answer, because maybe that problem they have, that error they have, is going to have consequences. But oftentimes, it can just be their little pet issue that they are wrong about. And I think we don't, there's that meme about someone's wrong on the internet. You can ruin your life correcting people, so that doesn't fix them either.
Don't police the comment section.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's it.
So this is a good question for Jeff, the localist, I suppose. We seem to currently be in a broader social milieu in the U.S. wherein large swaths of people are increasingly inhabiting different realities or worlds. What kind of practices are needed to help bridge these divides and create thicker, less siloed, and more diverse communities of communal truth-seeking and truth-telling?
Wow, that sounds great.
Yeah.
That's the burden that keeps me up at night, that question. I think part of it is if we can establish healthier rhythms around our devices and our sources of news consumption, of distant news, that frees up the kind of intellectual, emotional energy we need to reinvest in our churches, in our local communities, in our schools, wherever our spheres of influence are, places where we have a lot more opportunity to exercise agency, right? Because I think that is the pressing question. I think so often the underlying cause for why people cling to or get kind of caught up in these unhealthy digital virtual communities is because they're lonely, right? And the data on people without close friends, People with kind of reporting like suicidal levels of loneliness are really tragic. And so many of our kind of digital media type challenges are symptomatic of these underlying challenges. And so I think we need to invest a lot more of our efforts to befriend the people around us and invest our energies in those institutions, I guess. I'm not sure I answered the question, but I'm agreeing with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Bonnie?
No, I mean, I a lot of the stuff that I talk about in the book about habits, it's about time use, and I don't think it necessarily has to be like, oh, I'm going to join a book club, or I'm going to be in some sort of like formal community club. Like, it doesn't really exist anymore in the way it used to. But I think any time that we're spending with one another doing something normal, and that's not about throwing information and truth claims at each other, that's just a win in itself. It's a for the person whom we think is, very caught up and confused. It's a win for them to not be on their phones. It's a win for us to not be on our phones. And so, I mean, that's for a question like that. It sort of envisions like this great final state. I don't know that I can say any more than Jeff already said about like how we get there, but I think in terms of making that incremental progress, every time you have a potluck, you've at least taken a step in that direction.
A couple more practical questions, and we'll close with something to hopefully tie this all together. Someone asks, and this is, I imagine, more for Bonnie, and I could just say read her book, but let's give actual advice here.
Let's do the short knockoff version that's not as good.
So how might we integrate habits to successfully work towards better media consumption? And you have a whole chapter in your book about this, but quick hits.
I do. I think the quickest thing I would say is pay for it. No, a lot of the media's problems right now, and there are many, a lot of them are tied to this outstanding business model question of journalists need to make money to live, and we can't make money off ads the way we used to. And people have this idea that once something is on the internet, the article needs to be free to you in a way that you would never think about a physical paper. Like, we've all jumped paywalls. A paywall is like an offensive thing to us. But pay for the kind of journalism that you find valuable and trustworthy and want to see more of. Put your money where your mouth is. Because every time you jump a paywall at a good outlet, you're telling them their product isn't worthwhile. And every time you click on a garbage article, you're telling them that is worthwhile and that's what you want more of. And so I think the money aspect of it is really big. And I also think for us as consumers of news, it has a disciplining effect where if I am paying, especially at a higher rate, to get a magazine to come to my house or to be able to access a website of news, then when I want to read about some story, I'm more likely to go to that website because I've paid for it. I've paid for the right to be there. And so I think that knowledge of these are the 5 outlets that I'm paying for, it's going to remind you via your wallet to go to a better source rather than just whatever is sort of drifting through your social media feeds. And so I think paying for things that are valuable and that are good, it both encourages more of that, and also in your life it encourages you to steer away from sort of unfiltered, uncurated, possibly not very good or trustworthy things that just sort of drift into your life.
For both of you, are there specific red flags that you look for, or that you would encourage people to look for when they confront information or speakers, to say or to think, ooh, I think this might be bad information? Or what are some things that might stand out to you as indicative of misinformation or poor information? It's a big question. Are there like a few things that might immediately come to mind?
I mean, for me, it's when I'm reading something and I just, there's all these kind of lazy gestures that dismiss the opposition, or the framing is very negative, right? Like, these people over there are the enemy. And it's in this kind of environment of negative polarization. I think that's just the kind of rhetorical tick that often reminds their base that this is a safe space, right? I'm not going to have to think here. I can just move through this and have all my priors confirmed. But it shows me that the author's not willing to challenge me or help me think. Even if they're going to argue for a conclusion that I agree with, I want them to at least take seriously the fact that it's a complicated issue, there's different opinions, let's have some reporting here, let's actually think through this and not just confirm what they think
A few things off the top of my head, I would say in online media, sort of like a lot of people are saying, or here are 3 Twitter users who said, and that's sort of like the basis of the article. There needs to be a little bit more than that, ideally, before you've announced that there's this new controversy. At the outlet level, I would say if they don't issue corrections, or if they only issue corrections under legal threat, like you saw with a number of outlets around the voting machine allegations in 2020, all of a sudden they found themselves with a really robust corrections policy when there were millions of dollars on the line. And it's quite difficult to lose a defamation suit in America.
Yeah.
So they really messed up. And then the third thing I would say, and I think this is much more going to be in audio and video more than written media, is it just such a rapid onslaught of fact claims that you can't possibly consider, and it just comes again and again and again and again. And so by the time the 15 minutes or half an hour is over, you have sort of a vague impression. You couldn't get at any of the specifics. You know that those people are really bad, and there was a bunch of evidence. You can't remember any of it, but there was so much. It was so convincing. This is part of why I don't really consume any sort of serious content in a video format. I don't think it works as a way of conveying that kind of information well. I don't think TV news is really a worthwhile thing. And I don't listen to much radio or podcast either, because the way it just sort of rushes by you and you can't get a grasp on any of it, I don't think that's really serious to conducive thought. Certainly there are lots of examples of people doing that much better and much more carefully and more slowly than others. But I think that's a special risk there of just that real gallop of information that you can't keep up with, and it just leaves an impression.
Well, I think this will be our final question then. We're going to try to end on a more optimistic note. It's probably easy to feel, especially for those who you study these things and you're immersed in a lot of these questions, it's probably easy to feel a little down after a while. But I'm wondering, having done a lot of research on this over the last few years, as a journalist and someone who encounters this, and Jeff as a college professor who interacts with these ideas kind of in a not that Bonnie doesn't do lofty thinking, but in a loftier, academic setting, what are some reasons that you both have for optimism as we move forward here, as we continue to navigate this epistemic crisis, as Bonnie suggested, or Jeff talking about these information watersheds here? What are some reasons that you leave a little more optimistic despite the challenges we face?
The 2 things that I always come to, one is that I think there's a greater awareness that we do have a problem, and I think Jeff might have more to say on that and what he's observed in his classrooms. But so that's one thing. When I read my very long subtitle, people sort of know what I'm talking about, at least in a vague sense. And then the other one for me is, now that we are more aware that there's something going on here, something that we need to address, maybe we don't all have a great idea of how to address it, but we have experienced this crisis ourselves in many cases, and know what it's like, and know the risks, I think, of social media and the internet in a way that we could not when they first were introduced. And thinking back to my own childhood and my first encounters with the internet, the fears that my parents' generation had were just not super accurate fears. They were very centered on kidnapping and don't use your real information on the internet because you're going to get lured to the Walmart parking lot and taken away. And I think now we have a much better understanding that the risk is to our attention and the way that our minds work and the way that we're able to think about things. And so thinking about my own kids who are 3 and too young for any of this so far, I feel like I'm better equipped to guide their introduction to the public life and to the internet than my parents could have been, because my own brain is pretty messed up from having been online too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think, 10, 15 years ago, we would never have this conversation, right? And it's like, social media is going to save the world and spread truth. And maybe even 5 years ago, we could have it in the same sense, because then it was like, oh, doom and gloom. So I hope that we're kind of getting to the point where it's not naive optimism nor naive cynicism, pessimism, but there's a lot of people, my students even, but a lot of authors right now, and people thinking, how can we, MacGyver our way to use technology in ways that promote human and communal flourishing? And maybe our paths are not totally determined either toward paradise or hell, but that space for agency remains. It's not inevitable. And there's a lot more willingness to tinker and to say, as a community, as a family, as an institution, we're going to set some limits. We're going to try to use this stuff to help us better achieve these ends, whether they're ends of Christian formation in a church, or education in a classroom, or what we're trying to do with our families. As Bonnie says, the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that my students are much more cognizant of these issues, gives me hope that there's more will and thought behind thinking about and then practicing these ways of using technology for convivial purposes rather than nefarious ones.
Sure hope so. I hope so too. I want to make sure we acknowledge that this has been a really busy day for our speakers. They were supposed to get in last night and encountered a delayed flight coming out of Pittsburgh. So they woke up this morning in Chicago, got in to XNA about 10 o'clock this morning, and it's just been pretty much nonstop for them. So really appreciate their flexibility and engagement with us on campus in different environments today. Thank you so much, Bonnie and Jeff. Let's get them one more round of applause. Thank you.